The courtroom was tense as the judge looked over her papers, and then at the crowded room, her eyes calm yet piercing, she cleared her throat before speaking, her voice firm yet measured. The case had been dragged out for weeks, and the tension had only grown. The media had covered every detail from start to finish. But now, with the final ruling on the horizon, everyone was waiting for the last word of the judge. The room was packed with reporters and spectators eager to hear what would come next. It was the type of case that had captured the public's attention from the beginning. When Emily Stone had been named as the defendant, the nature of the case was already controversial, a protest that had turned into something far more chaotic than anyone had expected. Yet, it was Emily who had captured the headlines the most, not because of the protest itself, but because of who she was and who she had once been. The people in the courtroom were expecting a straightforward decision, a ruling based on the charges at hand, disturbing the peace, a public disturbance. But the judge's voice rang out in a way no one had anticipated. She spoke not just about the specifics of the protest, but about Emily's background, her past as a U.S. Army officer. The words hit the room like a bombshell. The media in attendance immediately perked up. Whispering spread like wildfire through the crowd. Some looked at each other in confusion. Others were shaking their heads as the details of her military service were suddenly revealed. Emily had been a soldier, and not just any soldier, but one who had served in high-risk combat zones. Her time in the military had shaped her in ways the public could never have known before. Now the judge continued, her gaze not leaving Emily for a moment, but her words took on a new tone. The courtroom fell silent as the judge mentioned how Emily had served honorably in multiple missions abroad and had faced extraordinary challenges. The focus shifted from the charges to the person before them. A woman whose service to her country was now being put under the spotlight. It was a revelation that no one had expected. It was almost as if the case had taken on a new dimension, one where the military past of the defendant became as important as the protest itself. Emily Stone had always kept her background hidden from public view. It was something she had never wanted to share with the world. She had stepped away from her life in the Army, not wanting to be defined by it. She thought that by leaving it behind, she could build a new life free from the past. But now that past was being forced into the present. The news that she had once been a soldier who had been decorated for her service was a bombshell in a case that was already attracting attention. The judge's mention of Emily's military service instantly put her under a new kind of scrutiny. The room became even more charged. The reporters had already been writing down every word the judge had said, and now they scribbled faster, trying to capture every detail of this unexpected revelation. What did it mean for the case? How would this new information affect the ruling? And how would the public react? Emily felt the weight of the moment settle over her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat, still trying to control the emotions that threatened to overtake her. She had thought her time in the Army was over. She had hoped it would stay buried. But now it was out there for everyone to see. The past she had tried so hard to forget had come rushing back to her like a wave pulling her under. The news spread quickly after the courtroom incident, and within hours, Emily Stone's life was no longer her own. Every news outlet in the country began to dive deep into her past, revealing parts of her story that had long been hidden. Emily, who had once kept her military background private, was now the subject of intense public scrutiny. What had once been a chapter she hoped to leave behind had suddenly become the focal point of a national conversation. In a matter of hours, her name was everywhere, on social media, on the front pages of newspapers, and dominating every news channel. It felt like the entire world was suddenly obsessed with the woman they had only known as the defendant in a protest case. As the media dug into her past, the pieces of Emily's story began to unfold like a series of puzzle pieces finally clicking together. Reporters began to share her military history, her enlistment at a young age, her rapid rise through the ranks, and her dedication to serving her country. They spoke about the numerous commendations she had received for her bravery in the field, including a medal for courage under fire. Emily had been recognized as a leader, respected by her peers and superiors alike. Her military career had been nothing short of impressive. Yet it was what came after that made people question the circumstances surrounding her current situation. The more the public learned about Emily's life, the more they realized her service had come with a heavy price. Behind the accolades and awards, there were dark memories she had never shared with anyone. Emily's time in combat had been grueling. She had witnessed things no one should ever have to see, and the weight of those experiences had stayed with her long after she returned home. A number of interviews with fellow veterans reveal a woman who had been deeply affected by her experiences, a woman who struggled with invisible wounds that were harder to see than any scar on her body. Her comrades spoke of a strong and capable officer, one who was always calm under pressure, always taking care of her team. But when Emily returned to civilian life, that strength began to fray. Her transition from military to civilian life had not been smooth. The trauma she had faced in the field followed her home, and the struggles that came with it were often too much to bear. It became clear that Emily had tried to push forward, tried to leave her past behind, but the toll of her military service was something that could never truly be erased. She had sought help from doctors and counselors, but the healing process was slow and uneven. Her struggles with PTSD, while not uncommon among veterans, made it increasingly difficult for her to find stability. She often felt lost, disconnected from the world around her, like a stranger in her own life. Emily did her best to keep this part of herself hidden, believing that her past was a burden that would never be understood by those who hadn't lived through the same experiences. Yet, as her story began to unfold in the media, the pieces of her life seemed to tell a different story. Emily's time in the military had shaped her, for better or worse, into the person she was now. The woman who stood in the courtroom was not just a defendant, but a symbol of the struggles that many veterans faced when they returned home. Her life was far more complicated than anyone had known, and as the public learned more, they began to see her not just as a woman in trouble, but as a woman who had been fighting battles long before the protest ever began. Suddenly, Emily's military background was no longer just a detail in a legal case. It became the key to understanding everything that had led to this moment. It was no longer just about the protest. It was about the deeper, unspoken issues that had shaped her life and the lives of many other veterans. As the media continued to unfold Emily Stone's story, the full scope of her military service began to emerge in a way that few had anticipated. People began to understand that the woman in the courtroom wasn't just a protester or a defendant, but someone who had endured far more than most could comprehend. The public, initially focused on her role in the protest, was now learning about the depths of her military background and what it had cost her. Emily had enlisted in the Army when she was just 18, driven by a sense of duty and a desire to serve her country. She had always been a determined individual, someone who wanted to prove herself capable of doing something bigger than herself. Her training had been rigorous, but Emily excelled. She quickly rose through the ranks, standing out as a leader among her peers. In her early years of service, she was deployed to several conflict zones where she learned the harsh realities of war. It was during one particular mission, however, that everything changed. Emily's unit had been stationed in a volatile region, a place where the lines between friend and foe were often blurred. The mission they were assigned was supposed to be straightforward, but it turned into a nightmare. An ambush by enemy forces left several of her team members injured, and one of her closest friends was killed right before her eyes. The incident was traumatic, and the impact it had on Emily was immediate. She had always been strong, but the loss of her friend shattered something inside her. The military gave her time to grieve, but nothing could repair the damage that had been done. Emily returned to the field, but she was never the same. The once strong leader now carried a heavy burden, haunted by flashbacks, nightmares, and a deep sense of guilt. She questioned her ability to lead, to be the officer she had once been. But she pushed on, compartmentalizing her pain in order to fulfill her duty. She buried her emotions deep, convincing herself that she needed to stay strong for her team, for her country. Yet, despite her best efforts, the trauma continued to linger. She couldn't outrun it. Eventually, an injury forced Emily to leave active duty. She returned home, but the transition from soldier to civilian was anything but smooth. Emily had trouble reintegrating into a life that no longer made sense to her. The bonds she had formed with her fellow soldiers were unlike any she had experienced in the civilian world. She felt disconnected, adrift in a world that didn't understand the sacrifices she had made. The haunting memories of war followed her, and with them came a sense of isolation. Emily tried to seek help, but the stigma around mental health issues in the military made it difficult for her to open up. She didn't want to be seen as weak or as someone who couldn't handle her past. Yet the weight of her experiences continued to drag her down. She found solace in protest movements, a way to channel her anger and frustration. But that path, too, brought its own set of complications. As Emily's military background became public knowledge, many began to sympathize with her. They understood that her actions weren't the result of a woman simply seeking attention or causing trouble. Instead, they were a manifestation of years of untreated trauma, years of invisible wounds that had festered beneath the surface. Emily's time in the military had shaped her, both in ways that had made her strong and in ways that had left her broken. Her journey had not been easy, and the toll it had taken on her was now evident for the world to see. Her story became more than just a case in the court of law. It was a story of resilience, of survival, and of the long-lasting effects of trauma. It was a story that many could relate to, but few truly understood. The narrative that had once been about protest was now about something deeper, something that would force society to confront the very real challenges faced by veterans like Emily Stone. As Emily Stone's background continued to be scrutinized, the focus of the case began to shift. What had started as a legal dispute over a protest was now a complex, multi-layered story involving the treatment of veterans, the scars of war, and the challenges of reintegration into civilian life. With each new piece of information that emerged, it became increasingly clear that the case was about more than just Emily's actions during the protest. It was a reflection of the larger issues faced by veterans when they returned home. The protest itself, which had seemed like an isolated incident at first, was now being viewed through a new lens. Emily and her fellow veterans had marched in response to what they perceived as unethical behavior by military contractors, companies that had profited from war while turning a blind eye to the human cost. The protest had been peaceful at first, but as emotions ran high, things began to spiral out of control. Emily, fueled by years of frustration and disillusionment, had been at the forefront of the demonstration, calling for accountability and justice. What followed was chaos. A scuffle broke out between protesters and law enforcement, and the situation quickly escalated. While the protest itself had been about standing up for the rights of veterans and holding those responsible for the consequences of war accountable, the media and authorities focused on the disruptive nature of the event. Emily found herself not only facing charges of public disturbance, but also becoming the face of a movement that many misunderstood. The accusations against her painted her as an instigator, someone who had caused a scene simply for the sake of chaos. But those who understood her story knew that her actions were born from something deeper, something more painful than anyone could see on the surface. As Emily's trial progressed, her legal defense team worked tirelessly to reshape the narrative. They brought in expert witnesses, mental health professionals, and fellow veterans to testify about the long-lasting effects of PTSD and the struggles faced by those who had served in combat. They argued that Emily's actions during the protest were a direct result of her unresolved trauma and the deep sense of anger she felt over the injustices she had witnessed during her time in the military. They highlighted her military service, painting her as a woman who had once been a proud and capable leader, but who had been broken by the weight of her experiences. The prosecution, however, was focused on the here and now. They presented Emily's behavior at the protest as a clear sign of recklessness and disregard for the law. They argued that, regardless of her past, her actions were unjustifiable. She had disrupted the peace, caused chaos, and set a dangerous example for others. The question of whether or not her military background should influence her current legal standing became a central point of contention. Could a person's past trauma be used as an excuse for their present actions? The courtroom became a battleground for the moral and legal implications of Emily's case. Outside the courtroom, the public's opinion remained divided. Some sympathized with Emily, understanding that her actions were born from years of trauma and frustration. Others believed that the law should be blind to personal history, and that the consequences of her actions should be the same as anyone else's. Emily's case became a flashpoint in a larger debate about how society treats its veterans, how their struggles are often overlooked, their mental health needs ignored, and their contributions undervalued. As the trial continued, it was clear that the outcome would not only affect Emily's future, but would also shake the national conversation about veterans and the challenges they face after they leave the battlefield. For Emily, the case was about more than just clearing her name. It was about finding a way to reconcile her past with her present and, perhaps, finding a way to heal. But whether or not she could ever truly heal was something she wasn't sure of yet. The courtroom was just another stage in her long journey, one that she hoped would bring her closer to understanding herself and the trauma she had carried for so long. As Emily's trial continued to capture the public's attention, the nation became divided over her actions. Social media exploded with debates about whether she was a symbol of injustice or a victim of her own history. The media coverage intensified, often portraying her as a pawn in a larger struggle for veteran rights, while others simply saw her as a troublemaker who had allowed her past to influence her present. The mixed reactions revealed the complexities of her case. While some supported her, viewing her as a woman struggling with the lasting effects of war, others remained critical, believing that her actions had crossed a line that could not be ignored. For Emily, the weight of public opinion became an unbearable burden. She had never wanted to be in the spotlight, let alone become the face of a national debate. She felt like a spectator in her own life, watching as people who didn't know her or her story made judgments about who she was and why she had acted the way she did. The outpouring of opinions, both for and against her, left her feeling isolated and alone, as though she was being defined by a single moment in time, a single misstep in an otherwise complicated life. Despite the growing media frenzy, Emily tried to keep a low profile. She avoided the cameras and the crowds, keeping to herself as much as possible. She spent long hours reflecting on the choices that had led her here, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Her thoughts often returned to the protest, the chaos, the anger, and the way it had spiraled out of control. In some ways, she understood why it had happened. Her frustration with the system, her deep sense of betrayal by the very institution she had once served, had built up over years of silent suffering. But now, as the case played out in front of her, she couldn't escape the reality that her actions had consequences, not just for her, but for those around her. Emily's legal team worked tirelessly to present her case in the best possible light, but it was clear that the outcome of the trial was far from certain. The defense had called in several experts, each of whom painted a picture of a woman broken by her experiences in the military. They spoke about the toll of war on mental health, about how PTSD could manifest in ways that were difficult for others to understand. They argued that Emily had acted out of a deep, unresolved pain, a pain that she had carried with her long after her service had ended. Yet, despite their efforts, the prosecution remained steadfast. They contended that Emily's actions of the protest were not simply the result of trauma, but of a deliberate disregard for the law. They argued that her service in the military should not be seen as a mitigating factor, and that the behavior she had exhibited at the protest was inexcusable. The courtroom became a battleground for moral and legal arguments, with the future of Emily's case hanging in the balance. For the first time in her life, Emily felt like she was caught in the middle of two worlds. On one hand, there was the world of her military service, a world she had once been proud to be a part of but now felt conflicted about. On the other hand, there was the world of her civilian life, a life that had been filled with struggle and alienation, but one where she had tried to find some semblance of peace. The tension between these two worlds was what had driven her to the protest in the first place. A deep desire to speak out against the injustices she had witnessed, a need to make her voice heard after years of silence. As the trial neared its conclusion, public sentiment continued to shift. Veteran groups rallied behind Emily, calling for more support for those who had served in combat zones. Mental health organizations seized upon the case as an opportunity to raise awareness about the struggles that many veterans faced, but that often went unacknowledged. The media, however, remained split. Some outlets focused on her military background, framing her as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, while others focused on her actions, deeming them reckless and irresponsible. Through it all, Emily remained uncertain of what the future held. She had never asked for this level of attention, but now it seemed as though her fate was tied to something much larger than herself. She couldn't help but wonder whether the outcome of the trial would change anything for her or if it would simply reinforce the divisions she had spent so long trying to bridge. Whatever the result, she knew one thing for certain. Her journey was far from over. As the trial reached its final days, the tension in the courtroom had become palpable. Emily sat in the same spot she had occupied since the beginning, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her face a mixture of determination and anxiety. The judge had asked for closing statements, and the room fell into an uneasy silence as both sides prepared to deliver their final arguments. For Emily, it was the culmination of months of uncertainty, fear, and internal conflict. But more than the legal outcome, it was her chance to be heard, to speak up about the pain that had shaped her life and the need for society to acknowledge the scars carried by so many veterans. Her defense team had done everything they could to present her as a woman who had been deeply affected by the trauma of war. They had presented expert testimonies from psychologists and fellow veterans, showing how Emily's military service had been marked by immense sacrifice and hardship. They argued that her actions at the protest were not driven by malice or a desire for chaos, but by a desperate need to be heard, to finally address the issues that had long been ignored. The weight of her service, the invisible wounds it had left behind, had driven her to a breaking point, and the protest had been the outlet for her frustration. But despite their best efforts, the prosecution remained adamant. They insisted that while Emily's past was tragic, it did not excuse her present behavior. They argued that she had crossed a line, disrupting the peace and creating a dangerous situation. Her military background, they contended, should not grant her special treatment in the eyes of the law. To them, Emily's actions were a blatant disregard for authority, and the consequences of her behavior had to be addressed. As the attorneys delivered their closing arguments, Emily's mind wandered. She thought about the countless hours she had spent in therapy, the nights she had spent trying to block out the memories of war, the times she had felt as though she would never escape the shadows of her past. She thought about the protest, about how it had started as an attempt to speak out against the systems that had failed veterans like herself. It had never been meant to become the violent, chaotic event that it had. But once things had spiraled out of control, she realized that the message had been lost. The focus had shifted from the real issues, the need for better treatment of veterans, the ongoing effects of PTSD, the challenges of reintegration, into a sensationalized media frenzy about lawlessness and disorder. The weight of it all was unbearable. Emily had never wanted to be a symbol, never wanted to be the face of something so controversial. But now, in the final moments of the trial, she knew that she had become just that. She had become the embodiment of all the frustrations and pain that many veterans experienced but rarely spoke about. The country's treatment of its soldiers, the toll of war on mental health, the societal stigma surrounding PTSD. These were the issues that had led her to this moment. She wasn't just fighting for her own future. She was fighting for the countless others who had never had the chance to share their stories. In the final moments before the judge would render her decision, Emily stood up, her heart racing. The courtroom went silent as she spoke, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I never wanted to be here," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "I never wanted to make my story public. But the truth is, the world has a way of pushing you to the edge. My time in the military taught me to fight for what's right, even when it's hard. I fought for my country, and now I'm fighting for myself. But this is bigger than me. This is about everyone who has ever been forgotten after they've served. This is about veterans who suffer in silence because no one listens." Her words hung in the air, resonating in the room long after she finished speaking. The judge, who had been carefully watching her, gave no indication of what was coming. The jury, who had been silent throughout the trial, now seemed to be considering the complexity of the case in a new light. Emily's plea wasn't just a defense. It was a call for understanding, a plea for the country to acknowledge the pain that veterans carry and to take action to address the issues that had led to her protest in the first place. The judge looked down at the papers before her, her face unreadable. The courtroom waited in silence, knowing that the decision she would make would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Emily, but for every veteran who had ever felt invisible. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the judge deliberated, her gavel poised above the sound block, the weight of Emily's words lingering in the air. It seemed like an eternity before she finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with gravity. The court has heard compelling arguments from both sides, and the facts presented have been thoughtfully considered. This case is not just about the actions of one individual, but about the broader implications of trauma, the treatment of veterans, and the moral responsibility we all share. Emily's heart pounded as she listened, her hands trembling at her sides. For a moment, the world felt like it was standing still. The judge continued, "Emily Stone, you have served your country with distinction. Your bravery on the battlefield is undeniable. Yet it is clear that your actions in the protest were a reflection of a larger, unaddressed issue, the mental and emotional toll of military service and the neglect that so many veterans face when they return home. The court recognizes the complexities of your situation and the deep personal struggles you have endured." Emily's breath caught in her throat as the judge paused, her gaze unwavering. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, unsure of what would come next. Then the judge spoke again, her tone shifting. "However, this court must also uphold the law and ensure that accountability is maintained. What happened during that protest cannot be ignored. Regardless of the circumstances that led you there, the actions you took that day resulted in harm and disruption. The law must be respected." The judge's words, though empathetic, were a reminder of the fine line that had to be walked between compassion and justice. Emily had hoped for a ruling that would acknowledge the trauma she had experienced without punishing her for the fallout of her actions. But she knew, deep down, that the system couldn't simply overlook her behavior. The judge finally delivered her decision. "In light of the extenuating circumstances, the court sentences you to community service, specifically to working with veterans organizations and mental health advocacy groups. In addition, you are required to attend therapy to address the ongoing psychological effects of your service. The goal of this sentence is not to punish, but to provide you with the tools necessary to heal and to give back to the community you fought for." There was a collective exhale from the room, as if everyone had been holding their breath in anticipation of a harsher sentence. Emily's heart began to slow, the tension that had built up over the course of the trial slowly dissipating. The judge's decision, though not without its consequences, was one that would allow her to continue her work on behalf of veterans while also seeking the healing she so desperately needed. As the courtroom emptied, Emily walked out with her lawyer, the weight of the decision settling over her. The media swarmed outside, their cameras flashing, but Emily, now more focused than ever, paid them no mind. She had been given a chance, an opportunity to make a difference, not just in her own life, but in the lives of countless others who had been left behind by the system. For Emily, the road ahead was still uncertain. The years of trauma, the scars of war that remained hidden beneath the surface, would not vanish overnight. But the ruling had given her a purpose, a sense of direction. She now had the chance to work directly with other veterans, to use her experience and voice to advocate for change. The next chapter of her life would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while, Emily felt a sense of hope. She was no longer defined by the protest or her past actions. She was defined by her resilience and her commitment to making a difference. As she walked away from the courthouse, the weight of the decision still fresh in her mind, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in years, a glimmer of peace. The long road to healing had just begun, but at least now, she wasn't walking it alone. In the weeks that followed the trial, Emily Stone threw herself into her community service work with a renewed sense of purpose. The terms of her sentence, working with veterans organizations and advocating for mental health awareness, were more than just a court-ordered obligation. They became her lifeline. For the first time since leaving the military, Emily felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, something that allowed her to channel the pain, anger, and confusion she had carried for so long into something positive. She began by volunteering at a local veterans center, offering support to men and women who had faced similar struggles. Many of them had been through what she had, but their stories remained locked away, rarely shared, rarely acknowledged. Emily's own journey gave her an understanding of their silent battles. She became a sounding board for those who needed someone who truly understood what it was like to come home from war, only to feel disconnected and abandoned. One afternoon, as Emily was meeting with a group of veterans of the center, she met Mark, a former soldier who had been struggling with severe PTSD. Mark had lost his wife to an overdose, an event he blamed on his inability to communicate and share his feelings. His isolation mirrored Emily's own experiences, and she saw in him the same haunting look of someone who had been deeply scared but didn't know how to heal. He confided in her about his struggle to reintegrate into civilian life and how he felt invisible to everyone around him. Emily, knowing how isolating it could be, shared her own story with him. She talked about the protest, about the trial, and how, in some strange way, the legal process had forced her to face her past. It had pushed her to seek help, to finally start the long process of healing. She could see a flicker of hope in Mark's eyes as he listened to her. He wasn't alone anymore. Neither of them were. Mark and Emily began working together to organize outreach events, bringing in experts to talk about the effects of trauma and the resources available to veterans. Slowly, they built a network of support, veterans helping veterans, opening up in ways they never had before. Emily was struck by how much this shared vulnerability had helped others, how speaking openly about their struggles had been the first step in finding healing. Outside the center, Emily's work began to gain recognition. News outlets, initially critical of her actions during the protest, started to focus on her current efforts to make a difference in the lives of other veterans. Her story was no longer just about a protest gone wrong or a court case. It was about someone who had found redemption in the service of others. Her name became synonymous with the fight for better treatment and mental health support for veterans. Through this work, Emily also began to heal. She attended therapy regularly, confronting the trauma that had been festering inside her for years. Slowly, she began to unpack the layers of guilt and pain, realizing that the loss of her friends in combat, the injuries she had sustained, and the emotional scars of war were not things she could fix overnight. But with each small step forward, Emily learned to forgive herself. She learned that healing was a process, not a destination. One evening, as Emily sat in her small apartment, reflecting on how far she had come, she received a letter from Mark. In it, he wrote about how much her friendship and guidance had meant to him. He thanked her for showing him that he wasn't alone, that he was part of a community of people who truly understood. The letter ended with a simple line, "Asterisk, you saved my life, asterisk." As Emily read those words, tears filled her eyes. In that moment, she understood what the judge had meant when she spoke about the opportunity to heal and give back. It wasn't about punishing her for past mistakes. It was about using her experiences to help others find their way through the darkness. Emily Stone had become more than just a veteran or a protester. She had become a symbol of resilience, of the power of redemption and healing, and of the importance of never giving up, no matter how difficult the journey might be. The road ahead wasn't always clear, and the scars of her past would always be a part of her. But Emily now knew that her future was in her hands. She had finally found her voice, and with it, she was determined to make sure that no veteran ever had to feel as invisible as she once had. Her journey of healing was ongoing, but now she walked it with the strength of others beside her, and that made all the difference.